12:25 p.m. Eastern Time. He also plans to meet in the Oval Office with a group of citizens who are participating in the new health care program. Go to our coverage, C-SPAN, to find out about our coverage, go to cspan.org. And now, live coverage of the House.
The House will be in order. The Chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., October 1st, 2013. I hereby appoint the Honorable George Holding to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 3rd, 2013, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each, but in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the cornerstones of my lifetime of public service has been to work on bipartisanship. I have a long record of working with Republican governors and senators back home in Oregon. Here in Congress, every major initiative I've advanced has been to find ways to engage bipartisan sponsorship, finding ways to bring people together to solve problems rather than divide them. But here in Congress, I must say it has been, under the Republican leadership, difficult, if not impossible. For example, there has been a claim that they want to repeal and replace Obamacare. They've never indicated a hint of how they would replace the Affordable Care Act and protect its most important provisions. They cannot say how they would produce a health care plan that would eliminate the stark specter of medical bankruptcy, which under the Affordable Care Act, Americans no longer have to fear. They have no plan to protect families from being denied health insurance because of pre-existing conditions and eliminate the pernicious lifetime limits which penalize families in the most desperate and tragic of circumstances. Now we're in the middle of their manufactured crisis of a government shutdown, and they risk a meltdown of the global economy by threatening America will not pay its bills on the national debt. There are 3 simple steps my Republican friends could take to prove they are serious and not cynical. First of all, Republicans campaigned the breadth of this country against the ACA, but they have included in their budget over $500 billion in savings under the Act and all of the revenues from the taxes. If they are serious and not cynical, they will remove that money from their budget and show what other services they would cut or taxes they would raise. If they are serious and not cynical, they would bring their own spending bills to the floor for their members' vote. Remember, we still have pending the Transportation HUD spending bill. On July 30th, they just stopped in the middle of it because they figured out that the bill was so bad that their own members wouldn't even vote for it. Well, if they are serious and not cynical about their spending plan, they ought to allow their members to vote on their own spending bills. See if there's any more support today than there was 3 months ago. Then bring the Interior spending bill to the floor, which has been in committee limbo. And the showstopper will be Labor, Health, and Human Services. If they are serious and not cynical, they will have the votes to show the American public what they really believe in. Last night, I was stunned that the final stunt in their Let's Make a Deal, made-for-TV, semi-reality show was to demand a conference committee be appointed. On what? They want a conference committee on a bill that has already been law for 3 years, that the American healthcare industry and local government have spent billions of dollars to be ready to implement, which goes into effect today. If you're serious together about working on a cooperative basis and negotiating differences and want a conference committee, why don't you appoint a conference committee on the budget? The Senate and the House have both approved budgets. The Republicans have refused to appoint conferees so that people can work together to resolve these differences. That is a pending item right now. Well, it's interesting. We had a jaw-dropping moment in the Budget Committee when my friend Chairman Paul Ryan said the reason they would not appoint conferees is because there might be motions to instruct. My goodness, the House might express its will and not be tightly controlled? We are now we're in the midst of a manufactured government shutdown crisis and a looming disaster if they throw a tantrum that would prevent America from paying its bills. Republicans can prove that they are serious and not cynical by not using the health care reform savings to fund their budget, bring their own spending bills to the floor and allow them to be voted on, and then have a conference committee not on a law that is 3 years old, but on a pending item between the House and the Senate.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Sooner or later, the system ought to be allowed to work.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This shutdown should not have happened. The framers of our Constitution designed our system to have tension and differences between the two houses of Congress. That's a given. But after the House and Senate have exercised their best judgment, they are then supposed to sit down and negotiate out their differences. This is the way our bicameral system has worked for 225 years. It is the only way that it can work. That hasn't happened this time. This time, the House proposed a compromise nearly 2 weeks ago to keep the government open and to defund Obamacare in order to address the epidemic of dropped health care policies, massive rate increases, and job cutbacks that we're now seeing as a result of its implementation. The Senate rejected that compromise by insisting on full funding with no reform. Well, that is their prerogative. It represents the best judgment of that body. But at that point, the differences were supposed to have been negotiated. They weren't. The Senate's leaders refused even to discuss a compromise. So the House offered a second compromise: fund the entire government, including Obamacare, but at least delay its implementation for a year to address the rapidly growing complaints that we are all receiving. Instead of taking up the measure, the Senate instead chose to take the weekend off, come in at a leisurely hour at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the day of the fiscal deadline, and then summarily reject the House offer, again refusing even to discuss a compromise. With the clock running out, the House offered a third compromise: fund the entire government, fund Obamacare, including the malfunctioning exchanges, but at least delay the mandate for individuals to obtain coverage for a year while these problems are addressed, and rescind the illegal action of the President that shields members of Congress from the costs of this law. It's a simple principle: equality under law. Since the President has already exempted big business from the mandate to provide health care for employees, then those employees should also be relieved from the mandate to purchase it. And if members of Congress can't afford the new costs of Obamacare, how do we expect the average American to do so? But once again, the Senate summarily rejected the third compromise by the House, and once again refused even to discuss our differences. And the clock ran out, and the government is now in a partial shutdown. Ironically, House Republicans have been accused of a my way or the highway approach, yet the record is quite the opposite. House Republicans compromised and compromised and compromised, only to be met by absolute intransigence at the door of the Senate. The House has now asked for a formal conference committee. This is the mechanism that has evolved over centuries to resolve even the most intractable differences between the two houses. Yet once again, Senate leaders summarily rejected the offer even before it was formally made. The only explanation for this conduct is that Senate leaders believe that a government shutdown inures to their political benefit because they can blame Republicans. If Mr. Reid and his followers didn't want a shutdown, they would have been feverishly working through this past weekend to avoid one, as the House was doing. The fact is they didn't, and that speaks volumes. Our system of governance was not designed to operate in this manner. It cannot operate in this manner. The essence of a bicameral legislature is for each house to act according to its best judgment, then isolate the differences, and then work them out. This is the critical link in our deliberative process, and it is not happening. Not because of any failure of design, but rather because of designing men. In his 1862 address to the Congress, Abraham Lincoln set the only course that is open to us. He said, "We can succeed only by concert. It is not, can any of us imagine better, but can we all do better? The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country." Mr. Speaker, I appeal to the Senate to set aside its dogmas, rise with the occasion, and accept the invitation of the House to sit down in conference. Then let us reason together, and then let us save our country. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Bera, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last night, just after midnight, Mr. Speaker, you allowed the government to shut down. Enough with the gimmicks. I'm not up here to play the blame game, to blame Republicans, to blame the President, to blame the Senate, to blame Democrats. That isn't what the American people want to hear. They want us to do our work. They want us to come together. And, Mr. Speaker, we need leadership at this juncture. You are the Speaker of the House. And this is a House that has both Democrats in it and Republicans. Mr. Speaker, we need your leadership at this moment to open the government and serve the American people. That's what they want to see. Be willing to work with Democrats in this body. You know, we're ready and waiting to work with you. My office is open. I'm a doctor. I'm happy to work with you on the Affordable Care Act and make this about taking care of patients. Make this about the American people. Mr. Speaker, we stand ready to do the country's work, but we need your leadership and your willingness to work with Democrats. You know, the Senate has passed a bill that will keep the government open. Bring it to the floor. If the Republicans don't like it, they'll vote against it. But bring it to the floor and give us a chance to vote up or down. That's how government should work. Give us a chance as a full body to vote up or down. We're here to work with you, Mr. Speaker, but bring that clean bill to the floor. And don't attach gimmicks to it. You know, keeping government open isn't about attaching a gimmick like access to birth control pills. That isn't what this is about. Stop attaching gimmicks. We're ready to work with you to strengthen and fix the Affordable Care Act and make it about the American patients, but this is about keeping government open. So let's do your job, Mr. Speaker. We need your leadership. You know, we've got to stop playing the blame game. This is surreal right now. This is not an episode of The West Wing. This is real life. And in fact, I'm going to read a letter from two constituents of mine, Matthew and Michelle. This is the real world. Representative Bera, I realize you are not the cause of the looming shutdown, but I'm begging you to do everything in your power to keep the shutdown from happening. My wedding is literally going to be ruined if the shutdown happens, as we were to marry in Glacier National Park on October 13th. It's messing up so many people's lives just because elected people in Washington can't work together. Now, here's what Matthew wrote. The constant bickering and self-interest rather than the interest of the general public seem to be the common focus for many in Congress. Start working together and getting things done. Mr. Speaker, this is not the time for bickering. We need to step up and do our job for all the Matthews and Michelles in America. They're watching, and they're the ones who are suffering. We need to put their interests ahead of political parties, ahead of individual interests. We got elected to do a job and put the people's interests first. We, the people. This is the United States of America. We have to start working together in a united way. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's do our work. We stand ready to work and open the government. Bring the bill to the floor. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, today President Obama and Senate Leader Reid got what they wanted. The federal government is shut down. House Republicans made 4 attempts to avoid a shutdown. All were denied a straight up and down vote in the United States Senate. And now they won't even agree to a conference committee to work out our differences between the two bodies, per the Constitution. Given this my way or the highway mentality, I want to briefly talk to the American people about what to expect in a bigger fiscal crisis, our impending default on the federal government's legal obligations by exceeding our debt limit. Without agreement between the President and Congress, in a few weeks, America will default on its obligations for the first time in its history. And I fear that our President and congressional Democrats will play politics with our debt ceiling, like they did with the government shutdown. And here are the words of a key player in this debate on increasing our debt ceiling. This was a speech in Congress, March 16, 2006. The fact that we're here today to debate raising America's debt limit is a sign of a leadership failure. It is a sign that the U.S. government can't pay its own bills. It is a sign that we now depend on ongoing financial assistance from foreign countries to finance our government's reckless fiscal policies. Over the past 5 years, our federal debt has increased by $3.5 trillion to $8.6 trillion. That is trillion with a T. That is money that we have borrowed from Social Security Trust Fund, borrowed from China and Japan, borrowed from American taxpayers. And over the next 5 years, between now and 2011, the President's budget will increase the debt by another $3.5 trillion. The Speaker continued. And the cost of our debt is one of the fastest growing expenses in the federal budget. This rising debt is a hidden domestic enemy, robbing our cities and states of critical investments in infrastructure. The Speaker continues. Every dollar we pay in interest is a dollar that is not going to investment in Americans' priorities. Instead, interest payments are a significant tax, a tax on all Americans, a debt tax that Washington does not want to talk about. If Washington was serious about honest tax relief in this country, we would see an effort to reduce our national debt by returning to responsible fiscal policies. The Speaker continues. Our debt also matters internationally. Now, there's nothing wrong with borrowing from foreign countries, but we must remember that the more we depend on foreign nations to lend us money, the more our economic security is tied to the whims of foreign leaders whose interests might not be aligned with ours. And finally, increasing America's debt weakens us domestically and internationally. Leadership means the buck stops here. Instead, Washington is shifting the burdens of bad choices today onto the backs of our children and grandchildren. America has a debt problem and a failure of leadership. America deserves better. I therefore intend to oppose the effort to increase America's debt limit. Those words were the words of Senator Barack Obama. Senator Obama is now our president. Unfortunately, President Obama has forgotten his words as a senator. In his first 4 years in office, he added more to our national debt than all the presidents combined in the history of America. And now, instead of working with Congress to fix this debt crisis and the drivers of this debt, the entitlement programs, our president is demanding a naked increase in our debt ceiling. Mr. President, the government did not have to shut down today. Mr. President, America does not need to go into default. Work less, please. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, today is a historic day in our country. Despite a Republican-led government shutdown that was completely unnecessary, we are celebrating the opening of the Affordable Care Act, or as I fondly, affectionately call it, Obamacare. You know, after almost 100 years of fighting to expand universal access to health insurance coverage in the United States of America, in 2010, the Congress finally passed, the President signed, and the Supreme Court upheld Obamacare as the law of the land. And starting today, Americans will be able to learn about the health plan choices and the financial assistance that's going to be available to them. An army of in-person assisters have been trained and stand ready to help Americans understand their options and enroll in coverage that best meets their needs. Americans can go to healthcare.gov, or in Illinois, where I'm from, getcoveredillinois.gov is up and running. Now, I have heard from my colleagues on the other side all these scare things about how terrible Obamacare is going to be for the country and for individuals. Let me read to you some constituent letters that I have received. This is from Gail Weiss. She says that I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis in 1997 and have continuously been denied affordable insurance since that time. I am so excited that our President has taken steps to help all Americans with access to health care. It's so fitting, she writes, that tomorrow is my 59th birthday, and what a fantastic birthday gift. Finally, I won't have to worry about losing everything I've worked for so hard. God forbid if I suffered a catastrophic health issue. No one should have to risk their future for something they have no control over, like illness. I heard from David Zoltan. He's 34 years old. This is what he writes. 1 week before Lehman Brothers went under, I was laid off from my job at the time and spent the next 2 years without health insurance. As a diabetic, the scariest thing in the world is to go without health insurance. Insulin averages around $100 to $120 per bottle, and I need approximately 3 bottles each of 2 kinds of insulin every month to live. I had to rely on my doctors to help me apply for charity. We could, or beg for the very medicines I needed to survive on a daily basis. Even so, I had to visit the hospital emergency room several times just to get insulin when my doctors couldn't get me free medication. Obamacare gave me the pre-existing condition plan pools as a lifetime until better solutions were available. Obamacare has done so much for me, and I'm proud today to see the beginning of the largest expansion of health care in my lifetime. There will be problems to fix, but we are America. We will fix these problems. We will give the precious necessity of health security to our citizens. We will prevail. And then I also heard from Eva Strobeck. She said, I used to get insurance from my husband, who retires in January. I am one of those people for whom it is impossible to get insurance independently. I have 3 illnesses. Obamacare makes it possible to get insurance at an affordable rate, which I cannot do without. My psychological medications alone cost about $5,000 per month. I can't survive without Obamacare. It must be funded by Congress. So I want to say that this effort to defund something that will bring life-saving health care to millions of Americans, about 30 million Americans, who either have to go bankrupt, who have to pay exorbitant prices, or simply have to do without health insurance, who would be against that? Are there going to be glitches in the program? Of course there were. Medicare Part D had news article after news article talking about the problems of this health benefit for the elderly. Let's get on with it and provide health care for all Americans, starting today.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Pierce. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are here this morning. Many in the nation have questions about how we arrived at this point. It's not that complex. Different people across the country elect people to represent their viewpoints. Even across my own state, the viewpoints vary widely. I probably represent 5 or 6 different demographics, different economic engines, different needs. We are sent here to make decisions, to make hard decisions. One of the toughest things that the nation faces right now is that we're on an unsustainable path in our United States budget. Those are not my words. They're the words of the specialists, the economists that we hire to tell us such things just last week, notating that what we're doing is not sustainable. The one side, I recognize their viewpoints, that they should provide more for more people. Other viewpoints are that we should live within our means as a nation, that we cannot continue to borrow from the future to pay for the present. And so we arrived at this budget negotiation, this way to fund the government, the continuing resolution. What should happen is that we pass 12 different appropriation bills funding the government, 1 unit at a time, with great insight coming from both points of view, both parties, both sides of the aisle. About 3 or 4 or 5 of those have been passed out of committee. Some have been sent to the Senate. Those have not been processed, but the House hasn't finished its work. So we were forced into a circumstance caused by both houses, both parties, that said we'll fund the government with a continuing resolution. That is, we will resolve to continue how we spent before. Those are sometimes inadequate, inaccurate reflections of current spending problems, current spending needs. But that's where we were. Now, the one side, the President said, we want you to just give us the money to spend. Our side said, we will do that, but we want things in return. If we're spending more than the nation can bring in, if we're spending more than the government has, then we would like to check that spending. We would give attention to the Affordable Care Act, to Obamacare, that we would choose that in order to relieve the pressure. the bill is unpaid for. We're printing the money to make government work now. About $1 trillion a year is being printed. We call it quantitative easing because printing sounds so crass to the American public. So we're quantitative easing $1 trillion a year, and yet we're bringing on another program which is unaffordable, in which we do not have the trillion or $2 trillion to spend. So our side said initially, we will give you the funding for the government, but on our side, we would like to defund the entire program. That position simply was never responded to by the Senate. In good faith, we said, okay, we understand your unspoken communication, so we notched down a bit. We will still continue the government funding at the price that you, the President, are asking for. And this time, we'll simply delay the program for 1 year. It's not working. It has problems in many different states. We still aren't certain where the funding comes from. And again, the President and the Senate remained silent, not even bothering to show up for work for a couple of days before they sent our first opinion back, simply rejected. The second was sent back, and last night we were faced with another quandary. We said we will notch down one more time. We said we'll fund the government at the level you're requesting, but we should, on our side, suggest that we would delay the individual mandate. The President has given many individual exemptions. He's given waivers to companies, to unions. He said to all employers, we're going to delay your input for a year. Last night, the Senate rejected that. That's the reason we're here today. I call on the Speaker, the President, and Mr. Reid to gather publicly in front of TV cameras and work the differences out. And I would yield back the balance of my time.
The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Pocan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a sad day for the American people and for American democracy. For weeks I've told my constituents that I know things look bad, but the Republicans won't shut down the government. There's too many adults in that side of the room to let this happen. And now, after watching what happened yesterday, I can barely explain this to myself. The best I can say is I feel like I'm serving in the nation's largest kindergarten, only we're in charge of the federal checkbook and the nuclear arsenal. The fact that so many Republicans are holding their breath because they don't like the Affordable Care Act. Congress passed the Affordable Care Act. The President signed the bill into law. The Supreme Court has upheld the law. And yet this body keeps voting to try to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Not just once or twice getting the message, but 46 times. And it's still operational today. And what happened last night in the final half hour before closing down our government? The Republicans came up with a last-ditch effort. Let's go to conference committee. I serve on the Budget Committee. We have been asking for 6 months to have the Republicans appoint conferees so we could have a budget in this country. The only obstacle between this country having a budget and not is the fact that the Speaker would refuse to appoint conferees to a budget. And last minute, with 15 minutes to spare, the best idea the Republicans have, after 46 votes to repeal the Affordable Care Act, is to have us go to a conference committee. What are the results of what happened? Well, 1, government is shut down. Thank you, Republican Party. 2, the Affordable Care Act is implementing today and is the law of the land. And 3, I'm guessing the Tea Party had a pretty good fundraising week or two. But here's what happens to the people in my district. People who are trying to get small business loans from the Small Business Administration are going to be halted. $1 billion a month that happens is halted right now, so we can't grow the economy. People trying to get housing loans for rural families and low and middle income families are going to be put on hold. The Women, Infant, and Children program for low-income pregnant women will be put on hold after this Congress has already tried to cut $39 billion from food stamps. We're going to block the Center for Disease Control from tracking influenza, something that could potentially have devastating impact across the country. And more than 800,000 federal employees are going to be furloughed because some Republicans couldn't get their way on the 46th try. I served in the Wisconsin legislature for 14 years before being here, and we've had our differences, but we always moved on. We did our jobs, and now it's time for Congress to do our job. It doesn't matter what party you belong to. America deserves better. The adults in the Republican Party need to take the keys back from the Tea Party before they have to call a tow truck to take the country out of the ditch. It's time for the country to act, and we need the Republicans to get behind something that gets a budget done. I yield back my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Gardner, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the weekend, this House worked to find a solution to the impasse over the continuing resolution, sending over various options to the Senate to try to jumpstart negotiations, to work through an agreement to find a solution to keep our government funded. In the early hours of this morning, we finally said to the leader of the U.S. Senate, Harry Reid, let's find a way to meet face-to-face through a conference committee to negotiate a solution and avoid a government shutdown. We've passed 3 times now measures to keep the government funded in a way to find solutions to this critical issue. But there are many people in Colorado who are struggling now because of the shutdown and who are worried about what happens to their situation, particularly those who may have been impacted by the flood. And that is why we must find a way to get government funded, to find a solution to get government going back on track while preventing policies that we know are bad for the economy. So let's work together and find solutions, but also at the same time ensuring certainty to people who are suffering from Colorado's greatest natural disaster. And that's why I bring to your attention a statement that the Vice President made on September 23rd in Greeley, Colorado, after touring the damage and devastation that those floods caused. I stood 2 feet away from the Vice President of the United States as he addressed the people of Colorado and said this: none of the federal assistance that we're providing, none of it is going to be impacted, even if there is a government shutdown. So while people may try to use this as a scare tactic, try to politicize a disaster, the Vice President himself stood before the people of Colorado and said there will be no impact on flood recovery. And yet we have seen in the newspaper, while people are trying to scare people to try to take away any kind of certainty that exists, but you can't take those words back. That's why I also sent a letter this morning to the White House reminding the White House, Mr. Speaker, of the promise that the Vice President made to the people of Colorado. And we as elected officials in Congress, in the Senate, the Governor of Colorado, we have a responsibility to make sure that the Vice President, the President, keep their word. They're true to the people of Colorado. That we make sure that indeed this statement, none of the federal assistance that we're providing, none of it is going to be impacted, even if there is a government shutdown. So while we work to resolve this issue before the government right now, while we work to make sure that policies are put in place to return to normal operations, we cannot let this be politicized. We cannot let the people of Colorado be forgotten. And we must hold the Vice President and the President accountable and true to their word. Mr. Speaker, I would like to submit for the record the letter that I sent to the White House this morning, and also the statement in full of the Vice President's comments. With that, I yield back.
I asked unanimously that these 2 gentlemen have allowed me to go ahead of them. I was on the list. Oh. I was on the list, so what's the problem?
It's okay.
All right. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio, for 5 minutes.
Thank the chair. Well, here we are. A gentleman who just proceeded. He doesn't want this to be political. It's totally political. You know, the Republicans spent billions on the last election. They lost badly in the presidential. They didn't take over the Senate. They even got 1.4 million fewer votes for the House, but because of gerrymandering, they're still in charge. So now they're attempting to usurp the constitutional order of the United States of America. They're saying that one half of one branch of the government of the United States, that is the Republican majority in the House, should dictate policy to the rest of the country. They should be the rulers. They can change laws. They can ignore the Senate, ignore the President. They are making unequivocal demands. They've taken the country, the government hostage. This is disruptive. It's expensive. It's inconvenient for a lot of Americans who need to access these agencies. I was just meeting with the Chief of the Forest Service. It's going to delay their capability of planning salvage and restoration activities on the hundreds of thousands, millions of acres across the West that burned. They're going to have to stop all that, and then winter sets in, and you're going to have big problems that you can't undo. But they don't care about any of that because this is totally political. Now, we're in the shutdown phase now, but their objective is to drag this out and hitch all of their demands. And if you've seen the list of demands, it's every bill that the Republicans have passed since they took over in 2011 that has not seen action in the Senate or been rejected by the Senate would be appended to the debt limit of the United States. Now, shutting down the government, pretty radical. But we are really dealing here with, for short, Cruisites, or I guess I would call them, they're sort of anarchist, radical libertarians who don't believe in government. They don't believe in evolution. They believe in devolution. Devolve all the duties to the states. Dissolve the union, essentially. Go to some loose federalism. And we'll reach some ideal point somehow. It's crazy stuff, but they're in charge. It's not even a majority of their caucus. It's a minority of their caucus who are dictating to the majority because with 211 fully red Republican districts, this is all about politics. Those people know that if they act reasonably here, that they will get an ultra-right-wing, nutcase, Tea Party primary challenge funded by the likes of the Koch brothers and others, very, very generously funded. So they've even managed not only to take the government hostage, but to intimidate their own truly conservative members, those who aren't Cruisite, anarchist, radical libertarians. Now, default is unbelievably irresponsible. Even a tiny threat of default, as they did a couple of years ago, downgraded our credit and drove up interest rates just a little bit, but we were much better off then. Today, if they do this, interest rates for everything in America will go up dramatically. That means tens of billions of dollars more per year just to retire the federal debt. They supposedly care about the debt. Well, they're going to raise the debt immediately by adding interest costs. It means home mortgages bump up again, stalls out the housing recovery. Cars go up again for loans. But, you know, they don't really care because they don't borrow money for things. Most of these people are rich. So they don't care. So what if it impacts hundreds of millions of Americans in their daily lives with their credit cards, with their car purchases, with their attempts to get at housing? They don't care. No, let's not make it political, guys. Yeah, no, this isn't political. Come on. You want to be responsible. What's it about? If it's about the problems with Obamacare, there are a lot of us over here who would like to fix it. You came in with repeal and replace, 42 times repealing. Where's the replace? What are you going to do about people who have pre-existing conditions? What are you going to do about kids between 18 and 26 who are in their parents' policies? What are you going to do about childhood disabilities who can get insurance now? What are you going to do about the 50 million uninsured people in this country? Where's the replace? Repeal, repeal, repeal. And now you're going to append a whole nother list of demands onto this. Not political. Of course not. Not political at all. You lost the presidential election. You lost the Senate election. You lost the popular vote for the House, but because of your gerrymandering, you're still in charge. You do not represent a majority opinion in the United States of America on these issues. Don't do irrevocable harm to our government, our country, our future to get your political demands met unilaterally. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to all my colleagues who have been trying to work hard to do what we came here to do, which is to govern. It's a disappointment to me that we're in a situation like this where government will begin to shut down. That's not good for America, that's not good for our districts, and that's not good for the hardworking taxpayers of this country. But I got to see politics at its worst over the last few days. We put forth a solution to stop a government shutdown. We asked for some simple corrections, simple changes to a law that many in this country, an overwhelming majority, say is going to be a train wreck. Even Democrats in the Senate say this law, as it is implemented, is going to be a train wreck. Now, why did we do it now? Because today is the day that the Obamacare exchange is open. Our opportunity to fix the problems that even many on the other side of the aisle see. They may have ended today. That's why we sent a bill that said defund Obamacare, like many Americans wanted, but avoid a government shutdown. The Senate said, we're not going to talk. We don't want to listen. So we said, well, let's just delay it for a year, just like the President has delayed it for big business and many of his political allies. The Senate again said, no, we don't want to hear from you. We don't want to talk. And we said, well, let's just delay the individual mandate because the President and his political allies don't have to follow the law that was passed here long before I got here. And again, the Senate said no. And what pains me the most as a brand new member of Congress, when we asked the Senate last night to keep the government open but get rid of their own special congressional perk and exemption in their own health care plan, they again said no. That no was a thumb right at the American people. That no cut right through the fabric of our communities in this country. When Congress, when the Senate said they deserve a special perk more than anyone else in America. That's shameful. That's why we're here today. We've put forth the plans to keep government running, and I believe we are going to continue to do that on our side of the aisle. It's time for the American people to demand governing not just out of our side of the aisle, but out of both sides of the aisle. We need to demand leadership out of this administration. We need to demand leadership from the Democrat-controlled Senate. Because what this has become, it's become politics. It's become a blame game. Who's going to be blamed for this government shutdown? And I guarantee both sides are going to be polling on this issue to determine who's going to get an advantage. Politics should not determine policy in this institution. Politics should not come before governing in this institution. And I think the American people should demand from everyone action, and they should demand it now. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington, Mr. McDermott, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, my father used to get up in the morning and say, "Today is the day which the Lord hath made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." It's a verse from the book of Joshua. And this is a day I think we can be positive about. All we're hearing is negative stuff and bad stuff, but let's talk about the good things. Today is the first day that in this country you have the ability to apply for health insurance. No matter what your status is, you can go down to the exchange and ask for a quote and buy an insurance policy, no matter what your condition is, no matter your employer, no matter what illnesses you have in your family, no matter what, you can have insurance. Now, that brings the United States up to the level of every other country in the industrialized world. For the first time, we have joined the countries that take care of the health security of their people. Now, it's going to be uneven. It's very clear it's going to be uneven across this country. I come from the West Coast. We call it the left coast. Washington, Oregon, California are up and running. They've been planning for 3 months how they're going to get out and get everybody enrolled. State of Washington's goal is something like 70% the first 6 months of those people who don't have insurance. I mean, we're serious about making this thing work. The governor of Kentucky has just said almost the same thing. There are spots across this country where you're going to see this law take effect, and people, for the first time in their life, can relax and know that they won't be bankrupted by an illness or an injury, or be able to say, I'm sorry, we can't do for you whatever is necessary to some member in their family. This is a great day. Now, in other states, people are going to stand around watching what's going on the West Coast and say, why can't we have what they have in California? Why can't we have what they have in Washington? And the answer is, look to your political leadership. Look to your members of Congress who said, no, we don't want to put a plan in. We don't want a plan. They'll say, oh, yes, we want to repeal and replace. But they never once put a replace on the table. I sit on the Ways and Means Committee, where Medicare came from and where this Affordable Care Act came from. The Republicans have been in control ever since it passed in 2009. They have never put a plan on the table to repeal and replace. They do not care about people who do not have health insurance. It is very clear. The governors across this country who have refused to take the Congress's generous offer of full funding for Medicaid are simply saying, we don't care about the poor people in our state. We are not going to provide health care for them. Even if the government, the federal government, will pay the whole thing, no, they can't have it. Now, the people of those states are going to have to look, Mr. Speaker, at their leadership and say, what are you doing? Do you not understand what it is to be a human being in this society without health insurance? And wait and wait and wait until whatever it is that's bothering you is so bad that you have to go to the emergency room? The reason some people have good health care in this country is because they have health insurance, and they can have preventive care. They can have mammograms, they can have colonoscopies, they can have blood pressure checks, they can have sugar checks, they can have all kinds of things that people who do not have health insurance don't have access to because they can't afford it. Now, beginning today, anybody in this country can have their blood pressure checked. They can have their blood sugar checked to see if they have high blood pressure or they have diabetes. They will be able to begin the process of having much better health care and not have to worry about what happens to their family. The political leadership that says, well, we want to repeal and replace. Bill Frist, who is the Republican leader of the Senate, I talked to him for about an hour one day on the phone. He said, Jim, what those guys ought to do is simply amend the bill that's there and make it work. There hasn't been a single amendment brought in the House to make it work better. I yield back the balance of my time. This is a wonderful day for everybody.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Conaway, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chairman, we're here during a I wouldn't call it historic, because historic are things that just simply happen every once in a while, but a shutdown of our federal government. It's come because our colleagues on the other side of the building have simply taken the attitude, it's my way or the highway. That's a wonderful way to look at life, but it rarely works in a life that you and I live in, and that most of our colleagues, our constituents live in back home. If you look at the Constitution by which we govern this country, it itself was a series of compromises. Big states, little states, unicameral, bicameral. across the board, there were compromises within that document that have allowed us to try to prolong and preserve this wonderful experiment that we call the American dream and self-governance. And this my way, the highway that our leadership, the leadership of the Senate has taken is calling that into question. The statements made over the last several days by the folks who support the leader in the Senate must make them feel really good. But those of us on the receiving end of those comments, it is insulting to be treated this way. It is insulting to have every opportunity we've put over there to try to reach a compromise on this issue, to have it simply dismissed out of hand, not taken up on its merits, but simply looked at and said, never mind. It's the lower body over there. We'll treat these folks like children. Their ideas are unworthy of simple consideration, unworthy of debate. Let's just table them and put them on the table with all the other hundreds of bills that this House has passed over the last 2 years and 8 months to try to move this country into a better position and move it further along. JFK said, let us never negotiate out of fear. And we agree with that. But he also said, let us not fear to negotiate. Why is Harry Reid fearing the negotiations? We've got our conferees ready to go. They've been named this morning, good men and women all. And the simple question is, Mr. Reid, where are your conferees? Why are you afraid of getting into a room with House Republicans and House Democrats, if they'll ever appoint their conferees, and work this issue out? Why are you fearing that optic? You're fearing it because you know that the American people are behind House Republicans in this effort to rein this in. At its core is the Affordable Care Act. The core of this issue is the Affordable Care Act. It is, without question, this country is on an unsustainable fiscal track. We cannot afford the promises we've already made to each other over the next 75 years. Our grandchildren are at risk for not being able to self-govern because of the spending plans that we've got in place right now. The Affordable Care Act adds a new third entitlement to that mix, and it also is unsustainable. So why would we want to continue this process in the face of the threats that we already have with respect to the spending plans that are now in place for Medicare and Social Security and Medicaid? They will bankrupt this country soon. We've got hard choices to make with health care. There are infinite demand. There is infinite demand for health care, unquestionable. And there are finite resources. That requires a reconciliation. At its core, this question of the Affordable Care Act is who does that reconciliation? Should it be governments? Should it be 15 bureaucrats in a room that nobody knows who they are deciding what that care should look like? Or should it be patients and caregivers making some of the most difficult decisions we will ever make in life to decide on health care issues? My money is on the folks in the fight. My money is on the families and the caregivers, and those processes make far better decisions in these very difficult reconciliation process than anything that could be done here in Washington, D.C. So at its core, that's the fight. Who makes your health care decisions at the end of the day? And how can this country afford the promises we've already made, which this President has said over and over that he will not negotiate with respect to Medicare and Social Security? Where are his plans? Where are Harry Reid's plans for those two entitlements? And now they've taken that same mantra with respect to the Affordable Care Act. They're refusing to negotiate anything about that. It's unseemly. It's un-American, and quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, my constituents are demanding that we fix this, that we stop this shutdown. It's unnecessary, but they also demand that the Senate come to the table with their conferees, and let's begin the process of working that out. It is unseemly, as I said, for the Senate to continue to dismiss out of hand every attempt. And quite frankly, those of us on the House Republican side are getting criticized for having to look like we're negotiating with ourselves, finding an attempt time and time again to try to find some middle ground that the Senate could, in fact, come to work with us. And this my way, the highway attitude that the leadership in the Senate has taken is beneath the dignity of this body. And I yield back.
The House will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker.
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has disagreed to the request of the House for a conference on H.J. Res. 59, joint resolution making continuing appropriation for fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes in which the concurrence of the House is requested.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Garcia, for 5 minutes.
I ask permission to revise and I ask for unanimous consent to revise it.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, this dog does not hunt. The cow has left the barn. This is absurd. I rise today to urge Congress to put aside partisan politics. We are playing a dangerous game with the majority of Americans agree is time to end. While certainly Congress needs to fix the Affordable Care Act. Of course, I've signed on to several of these bills. We want to make this work. But what is true is that this is behind us. We can neither go back nor start again. We need to fix what we have. Instead of finding common sense solutions, all we're doing is letting people go home and not respond to those needs. In Florida alone, 90,000 folks are going to be sent home. Not passing the legislation closes critical parks that are essential to tourism, hurts agencies that are essential to driving trade and commerce. This is ridiculous, and it is beneath the dignity of this body. You know, we've heard a lot of things from the other side here, and I understand messaging so that we can make the argument. But what needs to be done is we need to sit. I sat with my colleagues on the other side just yesterday. You could see the angst in their eyes, but unfortunately, they've been taken hostage by extremist elements in their party. The time has come to put these guys aside, come to a deal. We can fix a lot of these problems. We've cut government spending. We can do more of it. We can make government more efficient. We can fix the sequester and give agencies more flexibility. We agree with all of that on this side. We just need our colleagues to step up and push aside these extremist elements, this Taliban that is in America's core for some reason. It's time to act. It's time to fix this problem. Mr. Speaker, I ask you to please step forward. There are many of us that want to find a solution. We need to let the majority work its will. That is what the founders intended for the House of Representatives. It is the voice of the country. It is the popular voice. Please let the majority vote. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr.